The management of Western journalists by the KGB during the Cold War constituted a sustained operational system rather than a series of ad hoc reactions, reflecting the Soviet leadership's understanding that foreign correspondents were neither neutral observers nor simple propagandists, but persistent vectors through which information, interpretation, and legitimacy flowed across ideological boundaries. And from the late 1940s onward, this understanding shaped a comprehensive framework that combined access control, continuous surveillance, and narrative containment to influence what Western audiences could see, verify, and report about life inside the Soviet Union and its sphere. Because while the Soviet state could restrict internal dissent through censorship and repression, it could not prevent the presence of accredited foreign journalists without incurring diplomatic cost. And thus, it sought to transform that presence into a managed liability whose risks were minimized and whose potential utility was maximized. And the foundation of this system lay in accreditation, which functioned not merely as a bureaucratic requirement, but as the primary lever of control, since journalists were admitted only after extensive vetting and were made acutely aware that their continued access depended on compliance with formal rules and informal expectations, a dependency that allowed the KGB to exert pressure without overt coercion. And once accredited, correspondents were assigned housing, transportation arrangements, and official liaisons that embedded them within a controlled environment, ensuring that nearly every aspect of their professional and personal routine intersected with state oversight. And this embedding served multiple purposes because it simplified surveillance, limited unsupervised movement, and created predictable patterns that could be monitored for deviation, while also reinforcing the perception that access was a privilege granted by Soviet authorities, rather than a right inherent to journalistic practice. And within this environment, surveillance was continuous and multi-layered, extending beyond obvious monitoring to include the cultivation of informants among hotel staff, drivers, interpreters, and even fellow journalists, creating a dense web of observation that allowed the KGB to track contacts, conversations, and emerging storylines. And this surveillance was not solely defensive, because information collected on journalists' interests, habits, and vulnerabilities could be used proactively to guide their exposure to curated experiences, selectively granting interviews, travel permissions, or background briefings that aligned with desired narratives, while quietly denying or delaying requests that might lead to unfavorable reporting. And this selective facilitation was a core element of narrative containment, because it allowed the Soviet state to shape the menu of observable reality without issuing explicit directives about content, relying instead on the structural constraints of access to channel coverage toward topics deemed acceptable or advantageous. And the effectiveness of this approach was amplified by the logistical realities of reporting in the Soviet Union, where travel outside major cities required permits, local guides, and coordination with authorities, making independent verification difficult and increasing reliance on official sources, a reliance that the KGB and associated agencies exploited by presenting authoritative spokesmen and carefully staged environments as gateways to understanding. And while Western journalists were often aware of these constraints, the competitive pressures of reporting, combined with the scarcity of first-hand information, incentivized engagement within the system rather than withdrawal from it, reinforcing the Soviet calculation that management would be more effective than exclusion. And alongside access control and surveillance, the KGB employed more direct methods of influence, including background briefings framed as candid conversations, off-the-record guidance that blended genuine information with interpretive cues, and the subtle signaling of consequences through warnings about visa renewals or travel privileges, all calibrated to encourage self-censorship rather than provoke confrontation. And this calibration reflected an operational preference for containment over repression, because expelling or arresting journalists carried diplomatic risks and could validate hostile narratives, whereas inducing restraint preserved the appearance of openness while limiting substantive exposure. And when correspondents crossed perceived red lines, the response was typically incremental, beginning with delays, bureaucratic obstacles, or sudden restrictions that disrupted reporting rhythms and signaled disapproval without overt accusation. Allowing the journalist to adjust behavior without public incident, and only in cases of persistent defiance. Did authorities escalate to expulsion, a measure used sparingly to avoid drawing attention to the underlying mechanisms of control? And this graduated response system required close coordination between the KGB, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and party organs responsible for ideology, illustrating how journalist management was integrated into the broader apparatus of state security rather than treated as a peripheral concern. And over time, this integration produced institutional knowledge about Western media cultures, editorial pressures, and audience expectations, knowledge that informed how narratives were framed and which themes were emphasized, such as peace initiatives, cultural achievements, or economic modernization, while more sensitive subjects like internal repression, dissent, or military setbacks were deflected through denial, obfuscation, or controlled access to countervailing perspectives. And the cumulative effect of these practices was not to produce uniformly favorable coverage, but to narrow the range of plausible narratives, ensuring that even critical reporting operated within boundaries that minimized strategic damage. And this narrowing was particularly effective during periods of détente, when increased journalistic access created the appearance of transparency while expanding the scope for managed engagement, allowing the KGB to refine its techniques under conditions of heightened scrutiny. And throughout the Cold War, the system adapted to changes in media technology and journalistic practice, adjusting surveillance methods and access policies to account for faster communication, television reporting, and shifting editorial norms, while maintaining the core principles of dependency, observation, and narrative shaping, and by treating Western journalists as an enduring operational environment rather than a temporary nuisance. The KGB embedded information control into the fabric of international engagement, recognizing that in a conflict defined as much by perception as by power, the management of observers was itself a strategic function. And as a result, the Cold War information struggle was waged not only through official propaganda and clandestine operations, but through the quiet regulation of what could be seen, whom one could speak to, and how reality was experienced by those tasked with reporting it. A regulation that rarely produced dramatic confrontation, but consistently influenced the texture of Western understanding, illustrating how access control, surveillance, and narrative containment functioned together as a system designed to shape perception, without ever fully revealing the mechanisms by which that shaping occurred. As this system matured through the 1950s and 1960s, the KGB's management of Western journalists became increasingly sophisticated, shifting from reactive monitoring to anticipatory control, because Soviet authorities recognized that influence was most effective when exercised before narratives hardened rather than after publication, and this recognition led to the development of profiling practices that categorized correspondents according to their ideological leanings, institutional affiliations, professional ambitions, and perceived susceptibility to pressure, allowing the KGB to tailor its approach to each individual rather than relying on uniform restrictions. And these profiles were built through long-term observation, analysis of published work, intercepted communications, and reports from informants embedded in journalistic support networks, creating a detailed picture of how each correspondent operated and what incentives or constraints shaped their reporting. And once established, these profiles informed decisions about access, determining which journalists would be granted interviews with senior officials, permitted to travel to sensitive regions, or invited to cover carefully staged events designed to convey specific messages, while others found their requests delayed indefinitely or redirected toward less consequential topics. A differentiation that encouraged compliance by demonstrating tangible rewards for perceived reliability without requiring explicit instruction. And this selective access strategy was reinforced by the structure of official briefings, which blended factual updates with interpretive framing, guiding correspondents toward conclusions that aligned with Soviet objectives while maintaining the appearance of transparency. And because journalists depended on these briefings to meet reporting deadlines and satisfy editorial demands, the framing embedded within them exerted disproportionate influence, particularly when alternative sources were unavailable or difficult to verify. And the KGB's role in shaping these briefings ensured that sensitive issues were addressed on Soviet terms, either through preemptive explanation, deflection, or the provision of counter-narratives that complicated critical interpretation. And alongside these overt channels, the KGB maintained a constant presence in the informal spaces where journalists exchanged information, such as press clubs, hotels, and social gatherings, using informants and surveillance to monitor emerging storylines and to identify opportunities for intervention, whether by supplying selective information to steer coverage or by signaling displeasure before publication. And this informal dimension was crucial because it allowed influence to be exerted quietly, preserving the facade of journalistic independence while shaping outcomes behind the scenes. And when journalists sought to cultivate independent sources among Soviet citizens, the KGB responded through a combination of deterrence and control, discouraging unauthorized contact by making clear the risks to both the journalist and the local interlocutor, and by channeling interactions through approved intermediaries who could be monitored and managed, thereby limiting the scope for unsupervised reporting without resorting to overt bans. And this approach reflected an understanding that absolute isolation was neither feasible nor desirable, because limited interaction could enhance credibility and provide opportunities to guide interpretation, whereas total exclusion risked reinforcing hostile narratives about secrecy and repression, and the balance between openness and control was therefore continually adjusted in response to international context, tightening during periods of heightened tension and relaxing during phases of détente, when increased access could be leveraged to project confidence and normalcy. And during these periods of relative openness, the KGB expanded its engagement with journalists, facilitating cultural exchanges, regional travel, and extended stays that created a sense of familiarity and routine, conditions under which surveillance became less conspicuous and self-censorship more likely, because correspondents who felt embedded within the system were more inclined to avoid actions that might jeopardize their position. And this dynamic illustrates how influence often operated through normalization rather than intimidation, shaping behavior through dependency and habit rather than fear alone. And as Western media evolved, with television and later satellite transmission increasing the immediacy and visual impact of reporting, the KGB adapted by placing greater emphasis on managing images as well as words, carefully staging events, controlling camera access, and selecting visual environments that reinforced desired narratives, while restricting filming in areas that might reveal poverty, dissent, or military vulnerability. And this visual management became an integral component of narrative containment, recognizing that imagery could convey meaning more powerfully than text and thus required equal attention. And throughout this period, the KGB's management of journalists remained closely coordinated with broader foreign policy objectives, ensuring that information control complemented diplomatic initiatives and security priorities rather than operating in isolation. And this coordination underscored the extent to which journalism was treated as an operational domain within the Cold War, subject to planning, resource allocation, and performance assessment. And by the late Cold War, the accumulated experience of managing Western correspondents had produced a refined system that relied less on overt coercion than on structural dependency, information asymmetry, and anticipatory influence, demonstrating how access control, surveillance, and narrative containment could be woven into everyday administrative practice to shape external perception over time. And this system's effectiveness lay not in eliminating critical coverage, but in narrowing the range of interpretation, ensuring that even skeptical reporting unfolded within parameters that minimized strategic damage, a result achieved through patience, adaptability, and an institutional commitment to information control as a core function of state security. As the Cold War progressed into the 1970s and 1980s, the KGB's management of Western journalists increasingly reflected the cumulative experience of decades spent balancing restriction and engagement. Because by this stage, Soviet authorities had learned that absolute control was neither achievable nor strategically optimal in an era of expanding media reach and faster information flows, and instead, they refined a model that emphasized shaping context rather than suppressing content outright, allowing journalists to report within carefully constructed boundaries that limited strategic exposure while preserving the appearance of openness. And this refinement was particularly evident during periods of détente, when increased cultural and diplomatic exchange brought larger numbers of correspondents into the Soviet Union and heightened international attention to Soviet society, creating both risk and opportunity for the state security apparatus. And in response, the KGB expanded its anticipatory practices, monitoring editorial trends in Western media and adjusting access policies accordingly, granting visibility to themes that supported narratives of stability, modernization, or peaceful coexistence while deflecting attention from internal dissent, economic stagnation, or security vulnerabilities through bureaucratic delay and selective denial. And this approach required close coordination with other state institutions, including cultural ministries and local authorities, ensuring that the environments journalists encountered reinforced consistent messaging across multiple domains, from official statements to staged public events. And within this coordinated system, the role of surveillance evolved from simple observation to active feedback, as information gathered about journalists' interests and editorial priorities was used to fine-tune engagement strategies, offering tailored experiences that aligned with anticipated coverage and reduced the likelihood of unfavorable interpretation. And this tailoring extended to the management of crises, when the KGB sought to preempt hostile narratives by providing rapid, authoritative explanations framed to limit speculation, recognizing that early framing could anchor subsequent reporting, even if contradictory information emerged later. And such crisis management was evident in responses to incidents involving dissent, emigration, or security failures, where controlled access and selective briefing were used to contain fallout without provoking direct confrontation with foreign media outlets. And at the same time, the KGB maintained a reserve of coercive options that could be deployed when management failed, including visa denial, movement restriction, or expulsion, measures that were applied judiciously to reinforce boundaries without undermining the broader strategy of engagement. And this restraint reflected an understanding that heavy-handed action could be counterproductive, amplifying negative coverage and drawing attention to the very issues authorities sought to obscure. and thus escalation was managed carefully, with incremental pressure preferred over dramatic intervention, and this escalation control mirrored broader Soviet approaches to international crisis management, where the avoidance of sudden rupture was prioritized even as core interests were defended, and as media technology continued to evolve. The KGB adapted its practices to account for real-time transmission and increased scrutiny, tightening controls over live broadcasting, coordinating filming schedules, and monitoring transmission pathways to prevent unauthorized dissemination of sensitive material, while also investing in counter-narrative capabilities that could respond quickly to unfavorable reporting, illustrating how journalist management became part of a wider information ecosystem rather than a discrete function. And throughout these adaptations, the underlying logic remained consistent, treating Western journalists as a semi-permanent operational environment, whose presence had to be managed continuously rather than episodically, and by integrating access control, surveillance, and narrative shaping into routine administrative practice. The KGB ensured that influence was exerted steadily and predictably, reducing the likelihood of sudden informational shocks, and in doing so, it demonstrated a pragmatic recognition that in a globalized information environment, control could not rely solely on prohibition, but had to operate through structure, dependency, and expectation, shaping what was seen and how it was interpreted without requiring constant intervention. And this pragmatism became a defining feature of late Cold War information control, revealing how state security institutions adapted to the realities of sustained exposure while maintaining core objectives of stability and legitimacy. And as the Cold War approached its final decade, the accumulated weight of these practices underscored the central role of journalist management in the broader contest over perception, illustrating how the KGB's engagement with Western media evolved from rigid restriction to calibrated influence, while preserving the essential mechanisms of access control and surveillance that had defined the system from its inception. By the late Cold War period, the cumulative effects of decades of journalist management had produced a paradoxical environment in which Western correspondents operated with greater nominal access than ever before, while remaining embedded within a framework of constraint that continued to shape outcomes in subtle but consequential ways. Because although restrictions on travel and interviewing were selectively relaxed, the structural dependencies established earlier remained intact, ensuring that access to meaningful information still flowed through channels monitored and influenced by the state security apparatus. And within this environment, the KGB increasingly relied on predictability rather than intimidation, understanding that correspondents who had invested years in cultivating access were unlikely to jeopardize that position by pursuing reporting that crossed established red lines, a dynamic that encouraged self-regulation and reinforced narrative containment without constant intervention. And this reliance on predictability was supported by long-term relationship management, as KGB officers and affiliated officials maintained consistent points of contact with foreign press bureaus, creating professional routines that normalized oversight and reduced friction, while simultaneously providing opportunities to steer coverage through informal guidance and selective disclosure. And this normalization blurred the boundary between facilitation and control, making influence less visible and therefore more effective. And during this period, the KGB also refined its understanding of Western media ecosystems, recognizing that influence could be exerted not only at the point of access, but through anticipation of editorial decision-making processes abroad, and by identifying which themes were likely to resonate with Western audiences and which would be marginalized. Soviet authorities adjusted their engagement strategies to emphasize narratives that aligned with prevailing editorial interests, such as cultural exchange, arms control dialogue, or scientific achievement, while allowing less favorable topics to be crowded out by lack of access or competing stories, a technique that leveraged the scarcity of attention as a tool of control. And this approach proved particularly effective in managing coverage during high-profile summits and international events, where the concentration of journalists and the intensity of reporting created opportunities to shape narrative. Momentum through coordinated messaging and staged access, ensuring that initial impressions favored Soviet objectives, even if subsequent reporting introduced nuance or criticism. And when correspondents attempted to break from established patterns by cultivating unauthorized sources or pursuing sensitive investigations. The KGB responded through calibrated deterrence, employing surveillance visibility, bureaucratic obstacles, and subtle warnings to signal boundaries without provoking public confrontation, allowing most disputes to be resolved quietly before they escalated into incidents that might draw unwanted attention. And this emphasis on quiet resolution reflected an institutional preference for containment over confrontation, consistent with broader Soviet approaches to managing risk in a multipolar information environment. And from an operational perspective, the management of Western journalists thus became a form of long-duration influence campaign, sustained through routine, administrative practice rather than episodic action, requiring patience, institutional memory, and continuous adaptation to changing media technologies and norms. And this continuity ensured that even as individual correspondents rotated in and out of Moscow, the system itself remained stable, absorbing newcomers into established patterns of engagement and constraint. And for historians, the significance of this system lies in how it shaped Western understanding of the Soviet Union over time, not by producing uniform narratives, but by narrowing the range of perspectives available to reporters, influencing which stories could be pursued deeply and which remained anecdotal or marginal. And this narrowing had cumulative effects, shaping public perception through omission and emphasis rather than through overt distortion. And as the Cold War neared its end, the resilience of this system was tested by internal reform and increasing openness. Yet even then, the legacy of decades of management persisted, affecting how journalists interpreted new access and how authorities responded to scrutiny, demonstrating that information control, once institutionalized, does not dissolve quickly, but leaves enduring traces in practice and expectation. And in this sense, the KGB's management of Western journalists represents a central but often overlooked dimension of Cold War competition, illustrating how access control, surveillance, and narrative containment operated not as isolated tactics, but as an integrated system designed to shape perception over the long term, while avoiding the costs of overt repression. In the final phase of the Cold War, as political reform and systemic strain altered the internal dynamics of the Soviet state, the KGB's long-standing framework for managing Western journalists faced pressures that exposed both its adaptability and its limits, because policies of increased openness expanded the range of observable reality while leaving intact many of the structural mechanisms that had governed access and surveillance for decades, creating an environment in which journalists encountered more information without necessarily gaining full autonomy over how that information was contextualized or verified. And within this environment, the KGB adjusted by shifting emphasis from restriction to interpretation, recognizing that outright denial of access was no longer sustainable without undermining the credibility of reform, and instead focusing on shaping the interpretive frameworks through which new disclosures were understood, a task accomplished through selective briefings, controlled interviews, and the continued management of logistical dependencies that constrained independent verification. And this shift reflected an institutional understanding that influence in an era of openness depended less on preventing exposure than on framing it, guiding journalists toward narratives of transition, modernization, and inevitability while discouraging interpretations that emphasized systemic failure or loss of control. And this framing was reinforced by the continued presence of surveillance, which, though less visible, remained a constant reminder that engagement occurred within boundaries that could still be enforced if necessary, preserving a deterrent effect even as overt pressure receded. And as journalists navigated this environment, many found themselves balancing unprecedented access with lingering uncertainty about the durability of reforms, an uncertainty that shaped reporting by encouraging caution and incremental interpretation rather than definitive judgment, illustrating how long-standing management practices continued to influence behavior even as conditions changed. And operationally, the persistence of these practices underscores the durability of institutional systems designed for long-term influence. Because once access control, surveillance, and narrative shaping are embedded into administrative routine, they continue to function even as political objectives evolve, adapting to new contexts without requiring wholesale redesign. And from a historical perspective, this adaptability complicates assessments of openness, because increased visibility does not necessarily equate to unmediated understanding, particularly when the structures governing observation remain intact. And as the Cold War drew to a close, the accumulated experience of managing Western journalists left a lasting imprint on how information flowed between the Soviet Union and the outside world, shaping the baseline expectations of both authorities and correspondents. And in this sense, the end of the Cold War did not abruptly dissolve the practices developed over decades, but rather exposed their influence by revealing how deeply they had shaped norms of access, reporting, and interpretation. And when the Soviet system itself ultimately unraveled, the legacy of journalist management became visible in the fragmented and uneven nature of external understanding, as years of structured access and narrative containment gave way to a sudden expansion of information that was difficult to contextualize, precisely because the habits of management had conditioned both sides to operate within narrower frames. And this outcome highlights the paradox at the heart of Cold War information control, because the very success of long-term management in narrowing perception also limited the capacity to interpret rapid change when control weakened. And in this final view, the KGB's management of Western journalists can be understood as a sustained exercise in shaping the informational environment of rivalry, one that relied on access control, surveillance, and narrative containment not to eliminate scrutiny, but to regulate it over time, leaving a legacy that extended beyond the Cold War itself into the post-Cold War world of media, access, and perception. In concluding the examination of the KGB's management of Western journalists during the Cold War, the enduring significance of this system lies in how it institutionalized information control as a routine function of state security rather than as an episodic response to hostile coverage. Because by treating foreign correspondence as a permanent operational environment to be managed through access, surveillance, and narrative shaping, Soviet authorities embedded influence into the daily mechanics of international engagement, ensuring that perception was regulated continuously rather than corrected after the fact. And this approach reflected a sober recognition that in a conflict defined as much by legitimacy and interpretation as by military power, the observer could be as consequential as the adversary, and therefore required systematic attention. And across 4 decades, this system demonstrated remarkable continuity, adapting to changes in leadership, technology, and diplomatic climate while preserving its core logic of dependency and constraint, allowing the Soviet state to project an image of openness calibrated to strategic needs without surrendering control over what could be seen, verified, or contextualized. And for Western journalists, the result was an environment in which access was real but conditional, expansive in form yet limited in depth, encouraging reporting that navigated within established boundaries even when critical in tone. And this environment shaped not only individual stories, but cumulative understanding, influencing how entire societies perceived the Soviet Union over time through patterns of emphasis and omission rather than overt falsification. And from an operational standpoint, the management of journalists illustrated how escalation control could be applied to information itself, using incremental pressure, selective facilitation, and structural dependence to avoid confrontation while preserving authority. A method consistent with broader Soviet approaches to crisis management that favored stability and predictability over dramatic assertion. And as the Cold War ended, the persistence of these practices revealed how deeply they had conditioned expectations on both sides, complicating the interpretation of sudden openness and contributing to the uneven understanding that followed the collapse of the system that had sustained them. And in this sense, the KGB's management of Western journalists stands as a central case study in Cold War information warfare, demonstrating how access control, surveillance, and narrative containment function together as a long-duration strategy designed not to win individual headlines, but to shape the informational terrain over decades. And by examining this system in full, one gains insight into how power was exercised quietly through administration, routine, and expectation, reinforcing the broader lesson that during the Cold War, the struggle over perception was not waged only through propaganda or espionage, but through the disciplined regulation of observation itself, a regulation whose effects endured long after the institutions that created it ceased to exist.